We have several questions, so I will start with, can the constraint be out of the factory? Can we apply and how we apply theory of constraint when the constraint is, for example, at a supplier?
Can be outside, and of course, it's more or less true that, for instance, if I take the case of Airbus in Europe at the moment, the constraint is not the assembly lines of Airbus in Toulouse. It's one or a few suppliers in the supply chain. So yes, this happens. When that happens, you just have to identify the constraint, which is external, then apply the ideas at the constraint, which is within a supplier. We often do that, or in fact, we're often called in to help a supplier that's the constraint or one of the major actors of the aeronautical industry. It's an unhealthy situation. That's to say that it's not the right place to be, because it means that your constraint and therefore your future, your performance is not in your own hands, right? So it's not healthy at all, but it happens quite often.
I have another question about constraints. How can you determine what's the best place for a constraint to be in a system?
Well, that's a good one, and I probably disappoint in my answer. But the problem is that on a case-by-case basis, there are so many things to take into account that it's hard to keep it very simple. But anyway, my definition, and this is Philip Marris, you won't find this in normal theory of constraints literature. The best constraint, or the least bad constraint, is the resource that will take the most time and or money to turn into a non-constraint. It's the most expensive or rare machine or resource, right? It can be either people or machines. If it's very, very expensive, it's probably a good idea for it to be the constraint. Why? Because if it's a non-constraint, you're going to have more of it than you need, and therefore you've got this very expensive thing, which you've got two when one would suffice, right? But then you have to take into account a number of other things, unfortunately, which makes it more complicated. The machines can be more or less reliable. The machines can be more or less flexible with setup times. The machines can be either in your part of your system that's make to order or make to stock. So there are a number of other parameters to take into account to define what is the least bad constraint. By the way, means some people are confusing where their constraint is and where it should be. As to say, we sometimes get invited into a company, they say, we love the theory of constraints, the goal, fantastic, come and see, here is our constraint. And they show us the most expensive machine in the factory. And I say, yeah, this is the constraint. Look at it. Wow, isn't it a beautiful thing? But it isn't, right? For instance, it's in quality control, that sort of stuff. So watch out. It should be the most expensive machine, but it's rarely truly the case.
We have a lot of questions about constraints. Number one is, in a unstable environment where you have supplier variability, you might have quality issues, supply chain risk, and so on. How can we be sure that we have found the true structural constraint and not something that might appear as a temporary constraint? So how can we distinguish a structural constraint from an issue, for example?
Good question, and it is a problem because quite often people are getting this subject wrong, right? That's to say that they say that they have wandering bottlenecks is either because they're looking at day-to-day variations in workloads from one machine to another, or they're also getting involved in quality management, batches that have been refused and all that sort of stuff, right? The mistake there is that you're looking at things in micromanagement much too close to execution. You should take a helicopter, stand back from the system, and try and see what the structural constraint is, where normally the queue of work in front of that constraint is always there. It might vary in size, but it's always there, right? People are confusing things with other resources where sometimes the queues disappear, right? These are problems that have to be dealt with and stuff, right? But what you really want to do is find the structural constraint, which is you see over a longer period of time, over a month, maybe 2 months, 3 months. The queue is always there. What we usually find, it's not always true, but what we usually find is that about 1/4 or 1/3 of the inventory is piled up in the queue in front of that constraint. Okay, so there should be a big queue in front of the constraint, and it should never get to zero. If that is the case, then you have found your constraint. It's not all these little problems that everybody's trying to manage on a day-to-day basis.
We'll switch a bit and go to critical chain. About the 2-for-1 rule, does this rule can also be applied in a portfolio of projects, because WIP is also a crucial levers to improve performance in projects? And can we apply it when we have long-term projects?
Yes, you definitely can apply 2-for-1 rule in project environments, in portfolios. The problem with new product development portfolios is that it's easy to have much too many projects in the portfolio. So nothing's coming out. It's a big mess. That's the situation that we start with. And if you can't get people to just stop and kill half the projects or 3/4 of the projects in their portfolio, then you have to apply the 2-for-1 rule. If we're talking about a portfolio of work that you sold to clients and stuff, you can't stop any your project because they've already got clients waiting for them and stuff. So you have to purge the system. And how can you do that? How can you reduce the number of projects you have in your system? You apply the 2-for-1 rule. Now, it's true that the average lead times of these things, these projects, which can be 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, in pharmaceuticals up to 8 years, means that the rule will take longer to have an impact on the system, right? It'll take longer for the system to purge, but logic is the same. And you often have to do that because either you sold the projects and you can't stop them, or your top management doesn't have the courage to freeze or stop any of the projects. So you have to deal with them. And the only way to deal with them is to break that problem into little problems, one after the other, and get them to have a little fight each time. When they launch a new project, they're only allowed to do it when 2 have been finished, right? So they break that big, massive problem into a regular little problem. So yes, it's very important to do it that way.
Again, with critical chain, when you have more than one project in the red zone of the fever chart, how do you decide which of the projects get the priority?
It's the steepest angle. That's to say, if the fever chart is going off in that direction, right? You look at the chart and you find the ones which has got the highest ratio of consumption of buffer with the lowest progress, and therefore the one which is the highest angle. Okay, that's the P1 in the example I gave in earlier on.
When would you implement CCPM, and when would you implement DBR to manage the flow?
Clearly, in nearly all our MRO of equipment, that's the aircraft itself or things that are complex, such as maybe a piece of landing gear. In MRO, we're nearly always using critical chain to manage a manufacturing process because of the variability. At the other extreme, manufacturing as such should be sufficiently repetitive for it to be able to be run using drum buffer rope or some kind of other management system for the flow. It's true that you do have environments in which it's a bit difficult to decide between the two.
What is the return on investment, or at least an average return on investment, when you apply a theory of constraint? Because I must convince my team, my management, that there are benefits doing so.
It's so good that you need to water down the reality, because otherwise people won't believe you and they'll think that you're being naive. If you look at the examples we gave, the return on investment is basically as soon as you start getting the results. That can be a question of weeks, sometimes even just days. The return on investment is often around 1 month, but don't tell that to your boss, who'll never believe it. The theory of constraints' real competitive edge is the speed with which it gets the results. I mean, you saw the examples I gave. Don't believe me, have a look at the videos by the people our clients who live through this. Results are just unbelievably fast. You press the button here, right, bing, and all the lights turn on because you've hit the constraint. Everything else has got excess capacity, and suddenly your system is producing a lot more. So the results, the return on investment is excellent because of the approach.
You mentioned in the conclusion the diagnostic. How do you manage to get the right vision and the good feedback with such a short diagnostic?
Why are we capable of doing it? It's because we've been doing this for a long time, right? Hundreds of times. And we see patterns. We know what to look for and what is likely and unlikely. We have an experienced set of senior managers, of which Jessica, who's asking the question, is part of. We've been doing this for over 10 years. We often have a pretty good idea of what we're going to find even before we start. We ask for a little bit of data before we start so that we know where to look and so forth. We have this checklist of probable problems and constraints that we're going to find. They're not secret. Watch out if your quality management, whatever the business, right? It's not just aeronautics. We're talking aeronautics today, but in the food business, in the medical and pharma business, quality control has become a constraint because there are more regulations and stuff. You've heard me. We're not hiding any of our tricks. Often, if there's heat treatment or surface treatment, that can be a constraint for a number of reasons. And as I say, I've done it hundreds of times. My teams have done it very, very often. And so we know how to do it and we know what to find. I guess it's because of the accumulated experience of Marris Consulting that we can do it this fast. If you find it hard to believe, have a look at the dozens of client testimonials specifically on that question. We've done a diagnostic with you. Tell us, how did it go? What do you think? And it's not just what we find technically speaking. And we spend time with people. And at the end of those 2 days, they already know where we're going, we're saying, and why. So that we're already part of the way towards building a solution at the end of the 2 days.
Thank you. That was the last question for today.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. And see you maybe in the next webinar, or call us if you want a diagnostic. Thank you very much.